Aloha, everybody. Welcome to the 2024 Housing Priorities Briefing. My name is Malia Adams, and I will be your moderator today for the Q&A portion. For our virtual audience, feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom during any point of the presentations. First, let's introduce our housing chairs. Senator Stanley Chang we have here on Zoom, and he has chaired the Senate Committee on Housing since 2019. On the House side, we have House Representative Luke Evslin, who became the chair of the Housing Committee in 2023. Representative Evslin, if you're available to begin your presentation.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. Hold on one second. I'm technologically inept, so I got to figure this out. Slideshow. All right, thank you guys all so much for coming. My name is Luke Evslin. I am the current chair of the Housing Committee in the House of Representatives, and I'm honored to be here talking about our priorities. And thank you to Senator Chang for setting this event up. The next time I might ask him to do it, maybe not the day after opening day here, and that was a busy day yesterday and busy time here, but no, really grateful to be here and talk to you guys. I have been the Housing Committee chair since December, so I'm very new to this position here. And I'm really grateful to my predecessor in the House, current Senator Hashimoto, who got appointed to the Senate and left a vacancy for me to take over the committee. But I learned a lot from Senator Hashimoto while on the committee, and he did a lot of really important work. And has been a sort of a tireless champion for funding for the dwelling unit revolving fund, the rental housing revolving fund, changes to landlord tenant code, a lot of really important issues. And I hope to, continue to carry that work forward. And I'm excited to be here today with Senator Chang, who I also continue to learn a lot from. Senator Chang and I think we see the housing crisis in really roughly the same from the same perspective, though I think our solutions are a little bit different. And we spend a lot of our time debating on the solutions here. So I think we are coming at it from two different ways. And for me, we need every answer here to the housing crisis. So I'm really excited to be working with Senator Chang through this next session to do what we can to solve this crisis. So yeah, I'm going to go through my legislative priorities here. And just to start off, I always start with this graph anytime I talk about housing, but I know we all know the cost of housing is really, really, really high. I think this graph just helps illuminate how bad it's gotten in that since the year I was born, the cost of existing homes have appreciated by 155% when adjusted for inflation, right? So relative to the cost of all other goods, the cost of housing has gone up by 155%. And what this graph just shows is cost of homes in blue, median wages in red, both adjusted for inflation. So what you can see is over time, median wages in Hawaii, roughly flat, cost of housing through the roof, right? So I hear people often like telling people in my generation, oh, you got to do like we did and work hard and save up and you can afford a house too. And it's like, no, this is such a different market than it ever was. And it's totally decimating our generation here. So I do think that this is the biggest crisis that we face in Hawaii. This next graph, just from you, Hiro, there briefly illustrates how bad it's gotten recently, and that only 33% of local residents can afford a single-family home. And so, what this crisis is doing is it's driving out migration away from Hawaii. It's driving homelessness. If you don't have enough homes, people are forced to live in beach parks. It's driving overcrowded households. It's driving families to work 2 or 3 jobs just to support their rent. Which just has incalculable tolls on our community. When you're working, 3 jobs and not with your kids, or you don't have money for education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for my generation, right, it's many of my friends have had to move away. So housing crisis consumes all of my thoughts and time, and really want to be here to work as hard as I can to try and solve it. So just briefly, a couple of slides here before I get into my actual legislative priorities, but part of the reason for this crisis, our primary driver, is just our lack of housing supply. right? Projected need of 50,000 homes over 5 years. The state is producing roughly half of that. Islands of Kauai and Maui, according to UHERO, are actually losing housing stock. So Kauai, where I'm from, we build about 150 homes per year. We got about 200 homes per year transitioning to vacation rentals. So literally declining housing stock. Maui County, similar thing, and this is even pre-fire, right? And then post-fire, obviously the crisis is just so much worse. Why are we not building enough homes? Certainly part of the answer is regulatory burden, right? This also comes from UHERO. They did some groundbreaking work on this front, just showing that Hawaii has by far the highest regulatory burden of any state in the country when it comes to building, right? There's certainly other factors too, but regulatory burden is a big one. So last couple of slides here before getting into my priorities. Just much of what I'm going to talk about here is about zoning reform. So I always like to start with kind of a quick overview of zoning in Hawaii. And I think it helps illustrate how we got to where we're at right now. So 1961, the very first state legislature in Hawaii passed a really groundbreaking state land use law, which I think has mostly, it was really well intended. The land has helped preserve large amounts of land in Hawaii. So really amazingly good outcomes from that land use law, but it's had some bad effects also. So the land use law, the clear intent of that law was to preserve and protect agricultural and conservation zone land, and to direct development into the areas where the infrastructure is. And so to do that, the state legislature, through the Land Use Commission, ended up zoning all of Hawaii into 4 broad zoning categories. There's agricultural and conservation zone land, conservation zone land, about half of land in Hawaii, no development allowed, very, very little development allowed. The state controls all of it. Right, this is a map of Kauai. The islands are all roughly similar. Interior of the island is conservation zone land. Half of land, or just under half, is agriculturally zoned. The state said development can occur on this land as long as it's accessory to a farm. Counties have control over how that plays out. The definition of accessory to a farm is very vague. So for the most part, development is allowed on agricultural land with some restrictions through the counties. And then the urban land use district. This was the district that the legislature clearly intended for development to occur, intended for development to be easy to occur in this area. The state handed all zoning authority to the counties within the urban district, right? So at the urban district, you can see it in red on the map here. It was basically all of our existing towns in Hawaii were classified as urban district. And then the counties, that's where they have all of their myriad of zoning tools within the urban district, right? There's residential use, commercial use, industrial use. There's even agricultural and open zone use in the urban district. Counties had full discretion. And sorry, when the law was passed was essentially the heyday, I would say, in America of suburban development patterns. So in the 60s and 70s, all around the country, very large lot subdivisions, single family homes primarily. And so the counties all adopted a similar development pattern through their own land use ordinances. This system is really unique in the country to have a dual state and local zoning code where the state is designating these areas and then the counties have authority within them. And what it resulted in, and this again is from UHERO, so we've got 4% of the land in Hawaii is available for, is the area intended for housing. Of that 4%, 7.5% allows for multifamily housing. So according to UHERO, that leaves essentially 0.3% of all of land in Hawaii is available for multifamily housing. So fast forward 60 years from 1960, the zoning codes haven't changed all that much in the counties. Essentially, our urban land use district is full. And what we have is lots of development pressure on agricultural land. So this is just a clip from Kauai General Plan. It's the island that I know best, but it's showing, and the outer islands are all pretty similar development patterns. 80% of new homes being built on agriculturally zoned land or open zone land or very low density residential land. Very little development actually happening within the urban cores where it should be happening. And as our Kauai General Plan says clearly, right, this exacerbates sprawl, it stresses limited rural infrastructure and increases traffic. And of course, leads to underproduction of housing, which is where we're at right now, and high housing prices. So I think broadly, we're failing to achieve the sort of dual tenets of the state land use law, preserve and protect agricultural and conservation zone land, we're not preserving and protecting agricultural land very well, and make urbanization efficient in the urban district, right? It's not efficient there either. So my primary legislative priority here is what just got filed and passed first reading yesterday, HB 1630. And the primary intent with this legislation is to make it as easy as possible for families to build multifamily housing, right? To convert their existing home into multifamily housing, or to build an ADU in your backyard. I personally on Kauai, the only way I can afford a mortgage is if I rent out half of my house. The idea is to make that as easy as possible for everybody statewide. And so what the bill does is it would allow, the counties would have to allow 4 units by right on all residential lots within the urban state land use district only. Doesn't apply within the SMA, areas along the coast, or natural hazard areas. The counties still have the full authority to impose land use regulations on those lots like they do right now. So zoning, design, size, subdivision standards, et cetera, right? So the county's tools that they have are setback requirements, height requirements, floor area ratio. None of that changes under this paradigm, right? So what it allows the counties to do, if they choose, is to say, okay, in this neighborhood, you're allowed to, interior of the house has to allow for at least 4 units. But the house has to look, approximately like the character of this existing neighborhood, if they're choosing, right? So it would give the counties the authority to ensure that we're not building, say, apartment complexes in residential areas in compliance with this, right? So with setback requirements, height requirements, et cetera. Counties still have full authority to restrict against short-term rentals in these extra units. And the counties, all this would do is force a change to the zoning code. They can still reject permits based on lack of infrastructure, right? If you don't have the water or wastewater capacity, the county's not going to grant you a permit for these dwelling units. So all it does is the zoning has to accommodate it, but there's still going to be lots of other barriers to actually building out these units to the entitled density. So that's one provision of the bill. That same bill would allow for by right subdivision or lot splitting within the urban district also only. So by right meaning it would be up to administrative review and not go through a planning commission with a minimum lot size of 1,200 square feet. So right now, again, in the 60s and 70s, counties all adopted essentially 6,000 to 8,000 minimum lot sizes statewide. City and county has some smaller ones, but for the most part, really large lots statewide. This is unique in that if you go to, even pre-state at Hawaii, plantation camps were 1,500 square feet. Essentially there, they were large lots, but if you took what the equivalent of a lot was for a plantation camp, they're closer to 1,500 square feet. If you go to inner-rig suburbs on the mainland, adjacent to urban areas, you're going to see lots of 2,000 square foot lots. Hawaii, again, almost entirely 6,000 square foot lots and more. So this would require the counties to go down to 1,200 square feet. Again, doesn't apply within the SMA or hazard areas. And the intention here is, again, if you got a 6,000 square foot lot, you can split that lot off, split it in half. You could, maybe sell it or give it to a child, let them build equity and build a house on that lot, which is otherwise impossible right now. And then also another barrier to multifamily development is impact fees. Right now, for the most part, many impact fees are charged per unit. So whether you're building a sprawling house on agricultural land or a small little house in the center of town, you're paying the same impact fees for that unit. And this would require impact fees to be charged on a square footage basis rather than on a unit basis. So a smaller home gets charged proportionally less impact fees. Also on the conversion of existing homes, right now, if you have a single family home, you try and convert that to a multifamily unit, you're often going to get nailed with the whole second set of impact fees on that conversion, even though the occupancy of the house isn't actually changing, right? You've got a 4-bedroom house, you want to say split a bedroom off for your parents to live in, you're paying impact fees again, which isn't fair. You've already paid impact fees on that single family structure. So all this would say is that if you're doing a conversion, you got to deduct out the square footage of the existing space, essentially. So you can't double charge for existing space with the intention of reducing impact fees on those conversions. So that's the big bill, 1630. Another bill along these lines, which hopefully we'll file on Monday, would the counties would have to allow residential construction in all commercial areas So we, again, 60s and 70s, heyday of sort of Euclidean zoning, lots of separation of uses. There's large swaths still of urban Honolulu, which are commercially zoned only at a time when we got lots of vacant commercial buildings, et cetera, right? So counties would have to allow residential development in all commercial areas. They can require it to the second floor and above if they choose. Doesn't apply to areas under HCDA control. Counties would also have to adopt provisions to allow for adaptive reuse of commercial buildings, right? So lots of commercial buildings, they were built for commercial buildings. They are really hard to convert because the space wasn't designed for residential uses. And so the counties would essentially have to come up with code provisions to allow these conversions to occur, have to allow units as small as 220 square feet, which is kind of the smallest buildable unit per the building code. And then have to follow the International Building Code. And just to be clear on this, the International Building Code does allow interior interior bedrooms, as long as you have adequate ventilation and lighting. So the counties would have to allow, through the International Building Code, the possibility of interior bedroom units. And then also another barrier for these conversions is often, say you have a tower built for commercial uses, built to a certain parking restriction. You come in trying to do residential unit uses. The zoning might require a whole lot more parking. You don't have you can't rebuild your parking garage. So this would just say counties couldn't come in with higher parking restrictions than the building already has. And then this other bill hasn't been, it might have just been filed, but this is part of actually the wildfire package of bills here. This came out of our work on trying to, in the post-Maui fires, the House created a bunch of interim working groups to come up with disaster response policies for Maui and statewide. Maui has lots and lots of vacation rentals, as do all of the other islands. As I mentioned, Maui and Kauai are losing housing stock to vacation rentals. Currently, the counties don't have the authority to change the zoning and phase out those vacation rentals, right? So state law clearly says you cannot change the zoning or phase out uses within residential districts. So you have a vacation rental in a residential area, the county can't come and say you no longer have the right to vacation rent that. It's just not allowed via state law. All this would do is give the counties the authority to phase out these vacation rentals if they choose to, over a reasonable period of time. And again, that's actually introduced by Majority Leader Nakamura as part of the wildfire package. And then just a handful of sort of other notable bills here, which I've been working on through the summer. Most of them haven't been filed yet, but you should be able to see them by early next week. Looking to try and change the definition of historic property. Right now, historic property is defined as anything older than 50 years old. When 50 years was, plantation era, then that probably made sense. 50 years ago is 1973. There's not a whole lot of value in a lot of homes from 1973, or, I don't know if they all need to go through SHPD review. And what's happening is that SHPD is really, really backlogged on the review of these older properties. So this would just change the definition of historic property. Instead of 50-year threshold, it would be anything on the state or national historic register, or anything built pre-statehood, so 1959. Also working on trying to establish an ADU loan program through HHFDC. A major issue for the development of additional dwelling units is access to financing, especially with high interest rates. Unless you're wealthy, for the most part, you're not going to be able to get financing to build these units. So we're trying to develop a low interest loan program through HHFDC to give working class people access to capital to build ADUs. Also, potentially the elimination of school impact fees. School impact fees can be in the range of $3,000 plus per unit. And they are not being utilized in that they go into a fund for an eventual school to be constructed. We're not building new schools, so the money is just sitting in a fund. In my mind, it's essentially sort of a tax on my generation to pay for school repair, and it's a major barrier to housing construction. So eliminate school impact fees. And I want to be clear, I'm not trying to defund the School Facilities Authority, right? I just think that the funding should come through other forms of taxation, not an impact fee only on new development, only in that area. HB 1628 has been filed. This would, right now, a big loophole with the conveyance tax, right? Conveyance tax is when you sell your property, you get charged a conveyance tax for the sale of the property. A major loophole in the conveyance tax is that if you're just transferring a business interest or an LLC, you're not paying conveyance tax on that transfer. So For example, a large island was sold in Hawaii. There was no conveyance tax paid on that island because it was just a transfer of business interest. So this would close that loophole by charging LLCs essentially the conveyance tax when it's effectively a transfer of land. And part of the intent here is to reduce speculation and also to try and raise more money for affordable housing. This is Senator Hashimoto had worked on a bill through the summer to allow private activity bond recycling, which I'll be introducing on the House side. So right now you get a private activity bond through HHFDC. This is helping people get access to LIHTC credits, which is a primary source of funding for affordable housing. But then if they end up being able to repay that bond sooner than expected, that bond can't be reissued to a new developer. This would allow the bonds to be reissued to a new developer. HB 1632 require counties to allow self-certification of building permits. Many municipalities on the mainland put the onus on licensed engineers and architects to essentially certify that these plans are drawn to compliance instead of having to really spend all the time to go through detail by detail to make sure that they're in compliance. So this would just push the counties to come up with a program to allow self-certification of building permits. HB 1633 removes the prohibition on leasing units for, right now, if you get an owner builder exemption to build, anything, get a building permit, you have to sign an affidavit saying that you're not going to rent that unit out for a year. And so owner builder exemptions are generally going to be for smaller projects, like say somebody converting a single family home to a multifamily. Often all you got to do maybe is put up a wall and hire a plumber to put in a kitchen for you. For these projects, again, smaller projects, you're gonna have to sign the thing saying you're not gonna lease it. All this does is get rid of that prohibition, trying to make it easier for people to build multifamily housing. And then lastly, HB 1631 requires the School Facilities Authority to work with the DOE to prioritize the siting and building of projects, utilizing a lot of the School Facilities Authority is getting a lot of money to build student housing, teacher housing on DOE and around DOE campuses. This would just have them require that they collaborate on the siting and construction of those units. So that's in a nutshell what I've been working on this summer and my personal priorities for the Housing Committee. Members are going to have their own work that they've been working on. I just want to give credit also to my vice chair for the committee, Micah Ayu, has done a lot of work on landlord tenant code, also on a lot of regulatory reform stuff. So there'll be more bills good coming through him. And the individual members are, have their own priorities as well, which we'll be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Evslin. We do have already a couple of questions. I want to advise, though, that we will be getting to the questions at the end of the presentations today. So we do have virtual questions, and we see some people's hand raised on Zoom. So we'll be able to get to those at the end of the presentations. Senator Chang, if you could take it away.
Thank you so much to Representative Evslin for hosting today's meeting and for such an informative presentation. I can see how much work you've put in your short time as the housing chair in the House. I'm really looking forward to working with you on a lot of these priorities. I also want to acknowledge our new vice chair in the Senate Housing Committee, Senator Troy Hashimoto, who of course was the House Housing Chair before he came over to the Senate. So let me see if I can share. Hang on. Okay, so I want to begin with some good news. Since 2018, when I became housing chair, we worked on a package on a concept called Aloha Homes, or Affordable Locally Owned Homes for All. And these are homes that are revenue neutral, they're income blind, so they're sustainable, which means that they don't rely on large taxpayer subsidies. They can be built in good times and in bad times. And despite many years of obstacles, we are proud that we've made a number of important breakthroughs in recent years. HCDA is now undertaking a pilot project in the Kaka'ako area of Oahu. HHFDC now has the power to issue 99-year leases, and I'm told that they're interested in a 99-year leasehold project in the UH West Oahu area. And HPHA also has the power now to do mixed income and mixed financed housing projects. Notably, a year ago, they launched their 10,000 unit RFQ called Kalemomi, which is developing 10,000 new units of housing across all 4 counties. And as part of that project, they'll be building 4 new pilot buildings of this revenue neutral 99-year leasehold product. In addition to that, we have some naturally occurring revenue neutral income blind housing taking place. The county of Kauai has taken the initiative at Lima Ola to build some housing like that. And the University of Hawaii has 2 projects, one underway and one already completed, the Rise Dorm, a rendering of which you see on the screen before you. These are both revenue neutral and income blind. So it's taken time, but the Titanic has been turning around, and I'm cautiously optimistic that this concept is going to gain further momentum as time goes on and housing demand persists. So as part of our research into housing and successful housing systems around the world, I've now been to Vienna, Austria a couple of times, and it's a really fantastic model. Over 60% of their population lives in beautiful, high quality social housing. They have a very low homelessness rate. And in fact, they spend less money on rental subsidies than we do here in Hawaii. And most astoundingly of all, in Red Vienna, it's an openly socialist city and has been for most of the last 100 years. They spend 0 new taxpayer dollars in subsidizing new construction. So they're able to spend 0 new dollars and yet house everyone who needs it. The way they do so is by giving loans, not grants, to so-called limited profit housing associations. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But as you can see from this diagram, this is the only subsidy that they get. They get a low interest loan of 2.5% interest versus a 5% interest. And this slide is a few years old. So 5% interest might have been what they were getting in the open market and the private markets. The city was extending a 2.5% interest loan to build these units, which is how they were able to be significantly cheaper than the private market. And because they were loans and not grants, they were repaid. The loan fund revolved, and more housing was able to be built. Each new building enabled the construction of more new housing, as opposed to each new building resulting in that funding just disappearing. So this really interested me because, as we all know, the economic cycle goes through booms and busts. Sometimes we're flush with cash here at the legislature and we can afford to put in a lot of money, but sometimes we can't. And so I really wanted to apply this lesson of how we can have a sustainable housing production pipeline through both good times and bad, because as we all know, we need the housing whether economic times are good or bad. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the American housing subsidy system and some of the key flaws in it. So this is the way that most subsidized housing is built in Hawaii today. And it's roughly 1/3 each from these 3 financing sources. The first is LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit from the federal government. This is free money. It is not a loan. It never needs to get repaid. It just comes down from the federal government year after year. The second third is from a bank loan that is, of course, repaid by the rents that the tenants are paying. So, that's money that's also pretty secure, that's not out of pocket, so to speak, from the developer. That's just being collected every month from the tenants. The third major source of funding is state taxpayer dollars, the Rental Housing Revolving Fund. And let's talk a little bit more about the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, because it is very large. When it first started 30 years ago, it was only about $10 million in size. Today, it's over $1 billion in size. And I just want to walk you through how big this funding stream is. Every year, about $38 million goes into it from the proceeds of the conveyance tax. In addition, the Rental Housing Revolving Fund it does revolve, albeit slowly. And over the past 5 years on the slide, you can see that between about 4.6 and $19 million a year revolves back into the fund from loan repayments. So every year there's funding that flows into this fund from around, $43 million to as much as $57 million a year. And that's without really any action by the legislature, without any further appropriation. Now, the legislature does make further appropriations. As you can see, we have some very large ones that have already happened. Notably, in 2018, a $200 million infusion went into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund. In 2022, $300 million went into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund. Last year, the legislature adopted the multi-year budget that included for future years an additional $100 million for fiscal year 24-25 and $180 million for fiscal year 25 to 26, signaling legislative intent for future infusions of taxpayer dollars. And these are general fund dollars into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund. This is a lot of money. I think it's fair to say that there's no other fund in the entire state that gets such large infusions so regularly. I also want to note that on top of all the Rental Housing Revolving Fund infusions, DHHL received an enormous appropriation in 2022 of $600 million also to finance subsidized housing. So this is a lot of money. Let's all just, we all have to agree on that. And in fact, it's so much money that the Rental Housing Revolving Fund is, so the production of subsidized housing in Hawaii is capped now not by the amount of dollars that are flowing into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, but it is capped by the private activity bond cap that is set by the federal government and which we cannot raise. And so, this has really persuaded me that the dollars are not the issue any longer. I also, on the right-hand side, I want to highlight some facts that I've learned over the last year about just how sweet the terms of the Rental Housing Revolving Fund are. It's a 55-year loan, a very long loan. The interest rate is 0.25%. And as long as I've been alive, I don't think inflation has been below 0.52%, 0.25%. So this is, the state is losing money every year with each year of these loan repayments. The repayment doesn't even start until after the bank loan is repaid, which is after year 31. And that repayment depends entirely on cash flow. So if you don't have the cash flow coming in, you don't have to make those repayments, those full repayments. And on top of all of that, HHFDC has the power to forgive those loans in their entirety. This is such a sweet deal. I recently bought a home as a first-time home buyer. These terms are just completely commercially unreasonable. No home buyer would ever be able to get terms this good. And even nonprofit or charitable lenders would never do anything like this. Credit unions would not do this. Even charities would not do this. It's a commercially unreasonable set of terms that is entirely financed by the state taxpayer. So I want to just talk a little bit about why it's so unfair. So on the one hand, the buildings are temporarily affordable. For the most part, they are affordable only for 61 years. After 61 years, the developer is free to raise rents to market and sell for whatever the market will bear and collect a huge windfall. This is on top of already having collected a developer fee to actually build the building, which, by the way, they will collect even if the building is not built. If they do build the building, like I said, they own it from day one and they can sell it for this windfall profit that becomes very, very large after year 61. There's also minimal risk because, as has happened multiple times in the past, the developer, if they have cost overruns and they can't finish the building, they can simply come back for more tax credits. So what usually happens is not the developer reselling the building for market price. What usually happens is the state is pressured by the tenants who are freaking out because they know their rents could escalate to market, and they approach their legislators to buy back the building. And so whether it's through a direct buyback or whether it's through the financing of renovations to the building, the state is the one that steps in with big bucks to pay for the building a second time. a second affordability period, even though the state taxpayer already paid to build the building once. It's really not it's not a fair system. And this is the example that I always talk about. So in 1970, Kukui Gardens was built with federally subsidized loans. It was built by a gentleman named Clarence Ching, who was a really devout Catholic. The building was owned by his foundation, the Clarence Ching Foundation. In 2007, the foundation sold the building for $132.5 million. And the foundation is donating that money to St. Louis School, to Sacred Heart School, to hospitals, to a variety of worthy causes, but they are not housing related causes. And so that money that was created in housing, that was enabled by the federal taxpayer, has now been sucked out of housing and is now going into all of these other worthy causes. And we're never had to go into those worthy causes. These developers are free to use the proceeds of these sales to buy yachts or to do anything they want because it is their money. The other real consequence of this is that every new building that we finance with LIHTC and Rental Housing Revolving Fund expires. And so there are about 14,828 units that will no longer be affordable, that will expire sometime between now and 2100. And so this is a very long list of about 166 projects that we couldn't fit onto one slide without it being completely illegible. But you're free to contact my office to look at this list of 166 projects, their expiration dates between now and 2100, with over 14,000 families that will become homeless, essentially, because their rents will no longer be affordable after their affordability periods expire. What will happen to these families? Does the state have a plan to keep them housed? The answer is no. The only answer, the only plan that the state has and that these owners have is for the state taxpayer to continue dumping tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund to bail out these projects and to give these developers a windfall so in order for these low-income tenants to stay housed. This is fundamentally unfair. So what do we do? I think there's a number of things that we have to do. First, we have to stop the bleeding. We cannot continue to pour taxpayer dollars into temporarily affordable housing. Now, housing must be perpetually affordable, or it can be state or county built. They, of course, have no incentive to raise rents to market, or they can be built by so-called limited profit housing associations like Vienna does, where the profits are required to be used to build more housing. Second, we have to focus on government housing production. If the taxpayer pays for it, the taxpayer should own it. And lucky for us, as I've already mentioned, HPHA has embarked on a very ambitious new plan, probably the most ambitious of any public housing authority in the country in years, if not decades, to build 10,000 units here in Hawaii. Third, we have to make existing subsidies more efficient through innovative methods like credit enhancement and through building infrastructure rather than just paying for the 1/3 of the cost of new housing. And finally, we need to sharpen our existing tools that we have to streamline and to facilitate housing production, both public and private sectors, such as 201H-38. The ultimate vision here is to create a vigorous, entrepreneurial, and sustainable state government, sustainable both environmentally as well as financially. We're not talking about a small government or a big government. We're talking about a big government, a government that steps in where there are market failures at very little to no cost to taxpayers, and with the ability to deliver a need that all the people of Hawaii want without sending the profits directly into the pockets of private profit-seeking entities. That's what we're hoping to accomplish here. It's been accomplished with a number of other public services that are for the public, like public highways, public transportation, public schools, public libraries, public parks. And I hope that in the future, public housing will be a facet of that vigorous, entrepreneurial, and efficient state government. So let me get into some of the specific bills that we're working on to effectuate this vision. I'll start with reforming the existing subsidy system. And so here we have at the top here a couple of bills to amend the priorities of the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, again, to prioritize state and county projects and those that are built by private organizations that are required to use their profits to build more housing. We also want to reform the qualified allocation plan, which is the way that federal LIHTC dollars are allocated to, again, prioritize those organizations. We also want to prioritize perpetual affordability, as I've already mentioned, as well as early loan repayment. Because another way to make the Rental Housing Revolving Fund revolve faster is to incentivize those private lenders to refinance their loans after year 15, which private lenders are willing to do. And then that enables the fund to then relend, once those loans are repaid, to then loan those projects out again. We also have proposals for HHFDC to put out a lot more GO bonds, to develop housing for state residents who are owner or renter occupants and own no other real property. And finally, we want to close that provision by which the HHFDC can actually forgive outright rental housing revolving fund loans to private entities. We also want to use these existing subsidy programs in more innovative and efficient ways. So the first one is kind of interesting. The state is one of the largest depositors in private banks around the state, and we want to consider housing loans. We want when banks bid to be a state depository, we want them to be incentivized by including as a criterion the amount of loans that they're making for housing construction. We also want to, another way that we can subsidize housing more efficiently is not by actually subsidizing the vertical construction the way that RHRF currently does, but by paying for infrastructure for these units. And so that's another bill that we're trying to do. We also want to use the dwelling unit revolving fund to do some interim financing for new construction projects. Construction loans are much shorter. They revolve much faster than 55 years, typically only on a 5 to 6 year time horizon, which means that the funds are available again to subsidize the next project. We already mentioned the controlling interest transfer tax, Chair Evslin did. And he also mentioned the private activity bond recycling program. And that one is a big one because that can unlock really a lot of money. It's a technical change, but it could unlock as much as $300 to $400 million of new low interest loans, of which only 20% of the units have to be affordable to 50% of AMI, and 80% of the units are income blind. So that is another very, very large source of funding that could be made available with a fairly technical change and without as strict income requirements as some of the other programs that we have. We also want to use these funds to do credit enhancement. So credit enhancement is basically loan guarantees. And so instead of directly loaning the funds so that $1 of state funds builds $1 worth of housing, we would have the state putting those funds into a box and guaranteeing private sector loans made by private lenders to private developers and saying, all right, if Bank of Hawaii or First Hawaiian Bank lends this money to private developer ABC, ABC can then get a lower interest rate, maybe a longer term, and therefore deliver those units at a much cheaper cost, while the state doesn't have to spend any money. And the bank can leverage the state funds, not just on a 1-to-1 basis, but on 3 or even 4-to-1 basis, such that the state can enable $4 worth of housing construction for every $1 that the state puts into this fund. We also have a bill to establish an entirely new credit enhancement fund under a new agency that is not HHFDC. We also have a number of bills to facilitate housing production in a variety of ways. And Chair Evslin already went through a number of these concepts, like the IBC regarding ventilation and lighting. We also want to really give an additional pathway to 201H-38, which is probably the most effective single housing incentive streamlining program in the state since it was created. For the developers and for those professionals who are familiar with it, it waives a number of state and county restrictions and regulation and red tape, whatever you want to call it, as long as by state rule, half of the units are affordable to 140% of AMI or less. And that is a program that Council Chair Waters recently reminded me in his term in the council, they've approved 8 or 9 separate projects producing 6,000 units in the city and county alone. It's, I think, certainly the most effective in terms of the number of units housing streamlining production program that we have today. And what we're trying to do is to create a different pathway to access that streamlined process. Instead of the half the units being at 140% to AMI, we could create a different pathway as long as all of the units are for Hawaii residents and owner occupants or renter occupants who own no other real property, but could be income blind, and therefore enable these projects to be accelerated through this really attractive means of getting entitlements. SB 2063 also tinkers with the 201H-38 program, which would allow for, which would preempt the counties from having stricter income requirements than the state's 50% of the units at 140% of AMI. And that's an issue in a number of counties, I believe, including Oahu. We also have some bills that we've introduced now multiple years, SB 2029 to prohibit inclusionary zoning, where housing is offered exclusively for buyers who are Hawaii residents, owner occupants, and own no other real property. We have a bill to establish those limited profit housing associations like the ones in Vienna. We have a bill to exempt subsidized housing developments and government housing developments from school impact fees. We have a bill to exempt any code for 4 years after it's been published, which allows us, developers to rely on previous simpler versions of building codes. And let's see, SB 2011 is a new bill that we're introducing to allow multifamily construction on any of the designated commercial and industrial zones. SB 2027 is a bill modeled on a California law that we've introduced in the past. SB 2018 prevents counties from downzoning land, essentially, unless they provide for additional housing capacity on other lands. We have SB 2042, which requires counties to grant building permits within 60 days if applications are stamped and certified by licensed engineers and architects. And finally, a bill to require the Building Code Council to assess the financial impacts of new code or standards that are proposed. We also have some public sector production incentives like funding for the renovation of existing HPHA housing units. This is a concept that we introduce every year. I think the lowest hanging fruit in the entire state for unlocking new housing units are the housing units that become uninhabitable under federal regulations in the existing HPHA inventory, of which there are usually about a couple hundred every single year in all 4 counties because they fail health and safety regulations, which means that all it takes is a little bit of money to renovate and repair those units. They can be rented out right away to homeless families, families with almost no income, that's a proposal that we've been successful at getting funding at for most years. We also want to expand the housing powers of the counties to do mixed-use developments. I believe they currently have the ability to do mixed income up to 140% AMI, and this would, I think, lift that to market. We also want to maximize density on state lands. These are a number of bills that we've introduced in years past, again, to hopefully unrestrict the amount of density that the state can build on its own lands near the rail stations, to really maximize the potential of the rail system, but also to really maximize the potential housing that can be built there. Education housing is another hot topic year after year, and we want to, we've introduced a couple of these bills to facilitate that process. Unfortunately, SB 2002, I just saw, has probably the worst referral I've ever seen for a Senate bill in all my years in the Senate, and so I'm not sure that that bill is really going anywhere. Institutional weight to housing, to give housing greater institutional weight within the administration of the state of Hawaii. We've already proposed many of these bills in the past to create a Department of Housing that consolidates the many sub-department level state housing agencies like HHFDC, HPHA, the Office of Planning, HCDA, and so on. SB 2064 to authorize the right of first refusal to HHFDC for state-owned lands near the rail line, so we can ensure that they're being used for housing, which is their highest and best use. And also for the executive director of HHFDC to be nominated by the governor and Senate confirmed, again, to give that agency greater clout. We have a number of home buyer development and tenant bills. Again, these are bills that we've introduced in the past. And then finally, I want to put in a final plug to a bill that I've introduced multiple years in the past to do a continuous legislative session. For those of you who were present at the end of conference in the 2023 session, you saw just how chaotic the legislative session can be. And, you know, it was untransparent. It was totally opaque to the public. It was frankly just as opaque to us in the legislature. Many, if not most of the bills that died in that whole cattle call process died unbeknownst to me. We thought we had clearance from the money committees multiple times before we were told, and we were told that we did not multiple times. Unfortunately, that session is not the exception. That type of situation has happened many times at the state legislature in the past. You know, one of the favorite anecdotes that I've heard from legislators more senior than I recounts that in past years, chairs would actually, in the conference rooms, remove the clock from the wall to stop the clock at 1 minute before the deadline. And, you know, this is just not it's not a good way to make laws. It never has been. It's not a deliberative process. It's not accessible to the public. It's not even accessible to the members. And so having served on the city council of Honolulu, I've seen that process. There is no scarcity mentality when it comes to introducing new bills. Bills can be worked through in a really deliberative fashion. We can work with stakeholders. We can have dialogues with stakeholders. It may take longer to pass a bill. Months can go by, but we are not left with, you know, absolutely no recourse until the following January, as is the current system. And I think it just really removes a lot of the swampiness, a lot of the opacity, the choke points that exist in the current legislative session. And I think anyone who has worked both at the county level and at the state level would say that, you know, for all the flaws of the county lawmaking process, it is more accessible to the public, it is more transparent, and it is more predictable than the state process. So, if there's one thing that we can do to drain the swamp of the state legislative process, I think it would be this one. And so with that, thank you all for your kind attention, and I'd be happy to take part in the Q&A.
I just want to say real quick, Senator Chang, I appreciate all of your bills. That last one, I think my wife would not be so happy about, but no, I do appreciate the, you know, the depth and the breadth of the work that you've done here. And I think it goes to show just that, right, there is no silver bullet here. And I like how you split it up into private sector, public sector, you know, extensive work on financing. It's a really an all of the above approach.
Mahalo to both of the chairs for their great presentations today. So we are going to open up the room for questions. Please be advised, we do have virtual attendees as well. So in an effort to make sure that everybody gets their questions asked and hopefully answered, we are going to limit it to 1 minute or 1 question per individual. And we'll hop back and forth between virtual and in person. If you are in the room, please go ahead and make your way up to the mic once you have been acknowledged by, I guess, me or the chair. And for those that are asking on Zoom, if you do have your hand raised, please go ahead and put your question in the chat. That way we're still able to see it. But let's go ahead and start with a Zoom question. We have one from an anonymous attendee that's asked, many lots on Oahu are 3,500 to 5,000 square feet. Would this apply to those lots too? I think that was for your presentation.
Yeah, I assume that's asking regarding the part of the first HB 1630, which would require that the counties allow subdivision down to 1,200 square feet? And the answer is yes. In theory, it would apply to all lots, all residential lots within the urban state land use district. That said, there's still going to be infrastructure constraints for individual, say, lot splits. So if you got a 3,500 square foot lot and you want to split that in two, it's not to say that would be guaranteed to be allowed, because you still need to ensure you have adequate driveway access and infrastructure access, et cetera, et cetera. But the counties would have the authority still to implement and determine on their own.
Okay, do we have any questions in the audience? If you do, can you go ahead and raise your hand? No? Oh. Okay, if you want to come up to the mic, please.
I'm Betty Larson, and I'm interested in the ADUs because Oahu did approve, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, ADUs, and we were very excited about that and lots of support. And yet it seems that very few actual ADUs have been permitted, have been built. So, how does this new system work on the old system, which allows it 800 square feet maximum? So there were a lot of, things that we thought were good to kind of keep them affordable. But how will it work when you already have a system which doesn't seem to be producing?
Yeah, good question. My understanding is that the primary barrier is likely infrastructure on the permitting of most of these units. Again, if you don't have the water or wastewater capacity, you can't build them. So this wouldn't change that fundamental limiting capacity. And I also want to say, part of my attraction to zoning reform is that it's relatively easy to change zoning codes, right? The infrastructure is much harder, and in a lot of ways is going to consume the careers of me and Senator Chang and every other future representative here forever. In that it's going to be hard to figure out financing for infrastructure to make this work. But at least you get the zoning right, and then over time we have to ensure that we have the infrastructure there. So I can't say what the other primary barriers are for ADU development within the city and county, and that's also part of our job is to work through whatever those barriers are and reduce them as much as possible. And also on the 4-unit requirement, the expectation is that the counties will be implementing this. They'll have really broad authority to figure out essentially how to implement it, and the expectation is likely that they're going to be doing it in some combination of ADUs and junior ADUs. Kauai, for example, allows ADUs on every lot, plus 2 ARUs for every lot. So we have 4 units by right. The ARUs are relatively restricted on what you can do. They have size restrictions, et cetera. So the counties still have full authority to do what they want in that regard.
And we have one online on Zoom from Kevin Army for Representative Evslin. He says, congrats on your list of proposed bills, many of which we have been advocating for years. What about increasing the conveyance tax and eliminating the current cap on the portion of the tax that helps?
Yeah, I would actually appreciate hearing Senator Chang's thoughts on conveyance tax as well. I would like to see the upper rates increased. My concern with doing it under the current structure is that it can end up penalizing multifamily housing, in that if you have a single family home, again, turn that thing into a duplex, I've automatically raised the value of the house. By doing that, you're going potentially up a tier into a higher threshold of conveyance tax. And I don't know enough about the conveyance tax to know the impacts on sort of much larger multifamily structures that are sold. I personally, over time, would like to see a conveyance tax that's done on a sort of a per unit basis, or that the value of the tiers are based on per unit, so that you're not impacting multifamily housing negatively. All of that said, my understanding is that the governor's package has a conveyance tax bill, which, as I understand, I haven't seen the bill yet, but will include some upper rate increases with that money dedicated to infrastructure. Again, infrastructure, the great challenge of our time. We need dedicated funding sources for infrastructure. I certainly will be fully in support of well, I haven't quite seen the bill yet, but theoretically in support of the broad concept.
And now any questions?
Senator Chang, sorry, you want to respond to conveyance tax thoughts also, or?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I echo a lot of the concerns that you've raised, Chair Evslin. I also think that just historically speaking, it's fairly rare for a legislature to raise taxes during an election year. That's always an unpopular sell. And then finally, I would just add that, as I tried to emphasize during my presentation, the barrier that we're focusing on, the primary barrier to the production of new housing is not financial in nature, even for subsidized affordable housing. And if we were to do things like to unlock, either rental housing or DERF or other means of innovative financing for infrastructure, as HHFDC already has the power in many instances to do, that would be a much more efficient use of the funds that are pouring into this, into affordable housing subsidies.
Do we have any questions from our audience? I think you had one, yeah. And if you could state your name.
My name is Samaria Dao. I'm with the housing advocacy group organization called Kupono Kaleo Kaina. And thank you, Representative Evslin and Senator Chang, for your bill's presentation. I also had a question about the conveyance tax. Actually, I wanted to mention about your concern about the multifamily home thing, because I was kind of involved with the tax from last year. So the sale would only be, or the tax would only be applied when it's sold. So it wouldn't be like a property tax, whereas, it's monthly or yearly, whatever it is. So, most of our families here can't afford or don't live in a $2 million plus home. And most of the people buying them are investors. They're not people who are actually living here in Hawaii. So my question was, like, if you folks would be supportive of a conveyance tax measure that would provide funding for homeless services, because we clearly need more of that in our state. So that's my question. Thank you.
I go first. Yeah, there was a measure last year which had a lot of support from Kauai, SB, I forget the bill. That was actually before I got to the legislature, and I certainly supported that. And I do, again, I support increases to the rates on the higher tiers. I still think in the long run, we need to ensure that it's not a barrier to the construction of multifamily housing. If you have a 10-unit building that's getting sold, we don't want to ensure that we're taxing these at much, much higher rates than, the intention is reducing speculation and reducing high-end turnover and people sitting on land and making lots of money on it. So I totally get that. But if it ends up being a barrier to multi-unit development, then that needs to be addressed through statute, which, yeah.
Senator Chang, did you have a follow-up?
No, I think we addressed the conveyance tax pretty thoroughly in the last question too.
Great. This next question is for you, Senator Chang, from Kevin Army again. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that last name correctly. The question is, with the limited amount of funding available in Hawaii for low-income rental housing developers, are concerned about the impact HPHA will have on LIHTC, RHRF, and PAB financing for other projects in the pipeline. What are the state plans for keeping the production line flowing?
Well, I guess I might take issue a bit with the premise of this question, because as I've already outlined, the state has been pouring huge sums into subsidizing housing construction here in Hawaii, and that appetite, I think, continues. I'm told that in the House package this year, there's another $80 million into the rental housing revolving fund. I think that speaking of HPHA, they've hired a private sector developer to build their 10,000 units. And so the private sector is very much a partner in delivering new units when the government builds them. Now, in the distant future, that may not be necessary. Singapore, they don't do public-private partnerships like the one that HPHA or University of Hawaii or these other entities that are building housing are currently doing. They do everything in-house. But I guess I want to ensure, my high priority is that we create the greatest number of permanent affordable housing with the funds that we have, and the way to do so is by is through state and county ownership, in my opinion. And so I think that Private sector developers will have an important role to play, primarily as, fee developers. Basically, they're hired by these agencies but they're not going to, own the building at the end, the way it's been currently done for the last, almost 40 years.
Any member of the audience? No? Okay, hopping back. We have another question from Kevin Army for Senator Chang. Historically, government has not been a good landlord when it comes to multifamily housing. There are numerous examples of this across the country. And how do you expect Hawaii to be any different in caring for their newly proposed expansion?
So this is another question that I really want to question the assumptions of the underlying assumptions. So the federal government first got into building housing back in 1935 during the Great Depression New Deal era. And in that first Federal Housing Act, the private developers, represented by what is now the National Association of Realtors, won several important concessions as part of the congressional negotiation, one of which was that any federally subsidized housing had to be built very, very cheaply per square foot, which meant, of course, that there were going to be a lot of maintenance and repair issues. They also, more importantly, required an income limit on all tenants and residents of federally subsidized housing, which meant that only the poor could live in it and not the middle class, primarily because they did not want the competition from federal government for the American middle class housing market. And that bargain that was struck in 1935 has persisted to this day. Now, there have been ebbs and flows. Back in the 1960s, the Great Society era, well, peaking in the 1960s, but really even before that with Presidents Truman and Roosevelt, and then peaking under President Johnson, the federal government just decided to build a lot of housing that it would own outright. And that's the bulk of the HPHA portfolio in Hawaii today. HPHA was restricted from raising the rent. It could not raise the rent. It could not admit tenants that could pay rents that could actually cover the costs of maintenance and repairs. They were prohibited from doing so. And that's why the buildings fell into disrepair. And that is not, government didn't fail because government is inherently bad. Government failed because the private sector kneecapped the government from day one. So it is not, as a lawyer, the private sector does not have clean hands on the government being a bad landlord, like these accusations, like this idea that has pervaded, American housing discourse for the last 50 years would imply. I also want to, remind everybody, the whole reason why in 1935 the government got into the housing business was because the private sector had done such a terrible job of being slumlords, not just in, the Lower East Side of New York City with their tenements, but across the country. If you read the reports from the New Deal era, you'll see that there were people who were living without running water, without, the most heat, without the most basic of necessities in their homes that were all tenants of private landlords. And the federal government would not, the federal government would not have gotten involved had there not been such a dire crisis caused by private sector slumlords. And so if I can step back for a moment, I want to firmly take the position against the neoliberal consensus that really developed on the right wing of this country, and that has even infected the left wing. And I want to remind everyone here today that the low-income housing tax credit that subsidizes that is a pure giveaway to private developers today, was a creation of President Reagan in 1986 to gut President Johnson's large spending for federal public housing and simply transfer those funds to private sector developers. I also want to remind everyone here today that the Section 8 program that provides rental subsidies to poor tenants, same thing, was introduced by a Republican president, Ford, in order to gut Section 9 federal public housing. And both these Republican presidents largely succeeded. They took the idea that the government should build housing away and replaced it with the idea that the government needs to give money to private developers and to private landlords to build housing. I think that Section 8 is a little bit less objectionable than LIHTC, but we have to stop the practice of giving free money to private developers and then private developers pocketing 100% of the profits. That is not commercially reasonable. No charity has ever done this in America, and the government, the taxpayer, cannot be expected to continue this extremely bad deal. So to address the specific question, how can we make government a better landlord? That goes back to the initial Aloha Homes concept, which is that it is income blind and revenue neutral. It does not need to rely on subsidies that the folks in the Capitol building are unwilling to provide, especially in, economically down years. It needs to be revenue neutral, like existing condo projects developed by the private sector, where the condo owners pay a monthly maintenance fee to maintain their buildings. That is how Vienna does it. That is how Singapore does it. That is how Helsinki and Finland do it. That is how every successful social housing model in the country do it, in the world do it. They do not have those strict income caps. They are either fully or close to income blind by having residents of all income levels that are able to pay the rents or the prices that will sustain the cost of construction and sustain the maintenance and repairs. And that is true. By the way, that's also true for the private sector. Private sector landlords, their only magic trick is raising the rents enough to cover the costs of the maintenance and repairs. And that's it. So, either way, whether it's public or private sector, it's not that one is inherently better than the other. It's that the private sector has historically handicapped the public sector from charging enough rent to pay for the maintenance.
Audience members, do we have any questions? Yes, ma'am, if you can come up to the mic. And just want to advise that we have 1 minute for questioning per individual. And if you could state your name.
Aloha.
Hello.
Oops. PM Azinga. Aloha to everyone. My question is twofold. First of all, have we considered the United Nations designation of buildings that are quite preponderant in Fujian, China? There is a structure called Tulous, Tulou. And these structures last for centuries. I believe Fujian is one of our sister cities. And at UH Mano, we do have some individuals in the urban planning department that actually have been on the boards of constructing these magnificent housing, and they can house 1,000 people, Tulous. That's one question. Have we considered Tulous? The other question, Tulous are what is called compacted soil. So the soil is things like dirt and soil and all that kind of stuff. It's compacted. And then the other question is related to whether we, in our quest, what I see in the process is that we acknowledge housing, we get it through the state legislature, we say that it's affordable and for low income, and it's then constructed, and then it turns to fair market value, which that means the game is all over. Now we can't do it. Do I have any other second left? Okay.
We'll come back, but once we do one round of everyone, we'll definitely come back. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your question. In regards to Tulous, I am not aware of it. We'll definitely do some research on our side. And if you leave us your contact, we can get back to you on that. Regarding expiration of income restrictions, Senator Chang did address that in his bills. I don't know if Senator Chang, if you want to answer that aspect.
Yeah, I think we addressed the income restrictions pretty thoroughly. I just very quickly, I'm a strong supporter of dense housing, and I would not, pretend to tell the neighbor island counties how to plan their communities, but at least for Oahu along the rail line, I really think that the state needs to be maximizing density to take advantage of the existing transportation and other infrastructure, and and to maximize, to minimize the need for agricultural conservation or other, or otherwise undeveloped land.
Okay, we're going to skip to the last question. We'll come back for the other ones, but just want to emphasize this question for Senator Chang. When was the last time that HPHA built housing? It was stated that the legislature is funding the maintenance of their housing. If they can't maintain, what makes you think they can build? And that's coming from an anonymous attendee on Zoom.
I don't have the exact dates, but HPHA has not built Section 9 public housing in a long time. So the Faircloth Amendment, I think that was back in 1998, or as the kids say, the late 1900s, prohibited the federal government from net increases in the number of federal Section 9 public housing units. And Section 9, I'm just using to describe the official, public, capital P public housing that we think of when we say public housing. So since 1998, the HPHA and other public housing authorities cannot create new net increases in public housing. So what we've done at the legislature is we've allowed HPHA to build non-Section 9 housing, maybe lowercase p public housing that has fewer income restrictions, is not subject to the same federal regulations, that can be mixed income, that can be income blind, and therefore can pay for its own maintenance and sustain its own maintenance instead of just focusing on the very, very poorest. Now, existing HPHA housing does not get adequate funding to fully cover its repairs and maintenance. So yes, the legislature does need to step in, but they do get a lot of federal funding, and it may not be 100% of what their need is, but it's probably in the 80% level of what their need is. And the good news about Section 9 public housing is that the federal government does step in to cover the full amount of the rent for the residents, no matter how little the residents can afford to pay in rent. So federal Section 9 public housing is one of the only sources of large-scale housing sources that can immediately today move in a homeless family that has zero capacity to pay rent. If there is a vacant unit in public housing today, it can be rented out to a public housing unit that to a homeless family that can pay literally $0, and the federal government will pick up the cost of their rent. And with the thousands of units that are available in HPHA, the legacy units, I think that's a really precious resource that we really, really need to focus on if we are serious about housing the least among us, because we're not talking even about 60 or 80 or 50 or even 30% of AMI. I think the median public housing Section 9 tenant is like 8% of AMI. So these are really, truly people with very, very low incomes. And we need to support HPHA to the greatest extent possible in caring for formerly homeless families.
Thank you, Senator Chang. Is there anybody in the audience who has not asked a question yet? Okay. If you would like to come to the mic, please. And if you could state your name as well, and if you represent an organization. 1 minute, yes.
My name is Noinoi Lindsay. I'm from Maui. And I am a developer. So I understand actually the housing. And I lived there for 50 years and was born here. So I've seen this avalanche happen. But my question is, how do you convert what happened in the 30s to what could happen, say, in 30 years from now? How do you make that conversion so that the maintenance of all the structures that are built, no matter if they're private or not, are maintained on an island? It's really challenging, given how hard it is to build, where it's built, how to maintain it with the right materials. It's really challenging. Do you have an idea?
Senator Chang. Sure.
Yeah, that's a hard question, and the answer is not gonna happen overnight. For the legacy Section 9 public housing, it's of course heavily federally regulated, so there's not much that we can do other than to provide additional funds to renovate the units. And I think we should do that. I think that but again, the political reality is that it's very difficult to do because for various reasons, including the fact that the state goes through periodic economic downturns that leave the state struggling to fill gaps instead of, having surpluses to spend. But I think going forward, the answer is income blind housing that is available to all, where the residents can pay the full cost of their maintenance and upkeep. And that's, that's the private sector system essentially that we have today. It's not that private sector developers are, all that efficient, or that, homeowner associations never raise, monthly fees. I am in a homeowner association right now, and I can tell you that they certainly do go up year after year. It's just that they are less afraid to raise their rates and their prices and their monthly maintenance fees than the government, which, tender-hearted legislators like Chair Evslin here, when they hear families that are unable to afford rent increases, are just unwilling to raise the rents. And as a result, the revenue stream just goes less and less, which is why we have to open up a new model of housing for revenue neutral, income blind housing, instead of just focusing on the very poorest who truly cannot afford rent increases.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is exactly what you're getting at, but I do. Part of what really strict zoning codes have gotten us is that, like, for the first time in history, when we're building out a single family neighborhood, that neighborhood is built out into its like final state from the beginning, right? And it's different from the evolution of our towns and cities for all of human history that allowed for sort of continual evolution and growth, and that we build a single family neighborhood, and then that starts to age, and it's intended to be very, very static in a way. And I think a large part of that is a function of zoning codes that require only this type of use and nothing else, right? So I think, not to tie everything back to zoning reform, but I do think that there is a lot of value in trying to encourage a more variety of uses within a community to encourage the continual evolution of that community.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Chair, I think you can take this. Can we set up a housing commission that can approve projects unilaterally unless rejected by the supermajority of the legislature, like how the county salary commissions operate to approve legislative raises?
That sounds a little bit like the Beyond Barriers Working Group established by the governor through emergency proclamation. And I guess just on that note, I want to give the governor credit for the EP on housing and for establishing the Beyond Barriers Working Group, right? And he's taken a lot of heat for it. But I think to his credit, he was essentially doing everything that he could under his power, right? And he's in a lot of ways testing the limits of his power, and there's, was legal challenges, and he retracted that some. But in a lot of ways, what he was doing in trying to allow for different laws to be suspended, I think now in a lot of ways the ball is in our court for the legislature, right? He did what he could. Now we have to look at trying to codify as some aspects of that into law. And I think my concern over, say, a commission with a lot of power is that I don't think that necessarily discretionary review is the best way to make decisions through citizen commissions, in that it's much more valuable to have a set of clear standards for development, right? You check these boxes and you get your permit. And that is sort of at the core of by right development, right? For units by right, say subdivision by right, is that if you can check the boxes, you can get your permit rather than leave it up to the discretion of a set of individuals. And then lastly, I think also what would happen, say, in a permanent commission like that, is that it would be really focused on like the mega projects. Whereas, again, to bring it all back to zoning reform, right? The value in sort of dispersing this is giving individual homeowners the power to have much more flexibility over their things at a much almost sort of smaller individual house scale rather than the mega projects.
Do we have any questions from the audience members in person who hasn't asked a question yet? No? Okay, we have some on the chat. Kevin Army asked, continuous legislative sessions will provide us for more stability, better informed legislators, and better legislation. How do we help to push this forward?
And let me chime in first before Senator Chang comes. When I dismissed the idea, so my wife would be grumpy at me, I was half in jest there, and I totally agree with what Senator Chang is getting at here in the value of a continuous session. I also was on the county council. It does function very, very differently when you have sort of infinite time to get stuff through. I also see the value of having set timeframes to make sure we actually get stuff over the finish line here. But I do think extending the period for deliberation, there is a lot of value to that. I'll leave that to Senator Chang to talk about how we possibly get there.
Yeah, well, it first has to pass the legislature. So I haven't seen, I don't know if it's been, let's see, I'm not sure if we've, okay, I don't think we've, well, we have decked it, but it doesn't have a bill number yet. It'll be referred. And then once it goes to the committees, you can definitely encourage the committee chairs to hear the bill and to pass the bill, and you know, your legislator to, you know, support the measure. And then if it does clear the legislature, it'll have to go to the ballot. So then it'll be our duty to persuade the voters of Hawaii that this is a good idea. And there are a number of reasons why the voters wouldn't want this. I mean, I think that there's a perception that kind of an anti-government perception that the longer the legislature is in session, the more harm it can do. And of course, that's, I think the real harm is when you have a completely chaotic, you know, deliberative process where, you know, bills, weird mistakes happen all the time because the deadlines are, you know, tight, so tight here in the legislature, that don't happen at the county council level because they have all the time in the world to work through, you know, difficulties and obstacles and disagreements. But it would also, you know, it might cost more money to fly, you know, neighbor island legislators like Chair Evslin, not just for 4 months out of the year, but for, you know, 12 months out of the year, and to keep staff employed. And here I'm going to put in a plug for increasing staff pay. You know, our staff members have to work 2 jobs. Neither can afford a car. And I don't know, I know many other staffers in the legislature who have to work multiple jobs just to barely make ends meet. And again, if legislators do not have the assistance of staff that are trained, are knowledgeable, have historical knowledge, then we are going to make worse laws. That's just a fact. And so if we have a continuous legislative session, then I think that we would also probably need to pay a living wage to our staff members, especially to our session staffers. And, you know, we'd have to overcome all of those reservations in the minds of the voting public in order for this to become a reality. But I think it's worth it. I think it would just fundamentally change the way the legislature does business.
Thank you, Senator Chang. Audience members, any questions from anybody? If you wanted, you can come up in 1 minute, please.
Larson, you know, we work with many elderly people who cannot afford maybe not even as much as $400 a month at paying 50% of their income. So it's not that they're not willing to have housing and pay a great percentage of their income. So how do you address those? You talk about 30% AMI, but really a lot of people, seniors and working families, are below like you know, I think public housing ranges annual income between like 14 to 20,000, depending on the project. So they're working, they have income. It's not they're unwilling to pay rent. It's just a matter of that. If you own a condo, well, unfortunately, you might have to sell it, but then you need a rental. You may have some monies for a time and it has to stretch out. So it's that how can we put that in the system where, you know, the housing that Senator Chang talked about is great because you pay 30% of your income. It's, you know, the federally sponsored and all that. But we have a great number of people who are maybe on the edge, maybe not becoming homeless because they're paying 50, 60, but people pay 90% of their income with food stamps and medical on housing. So how do you address that, you know, below 30% AMI, even up to 40% AMI. I mean, Ellis families are struggling and they're in that kind of upper over 30%, but they're still can't afford their rent or it's really struggling to afford their rent. That maybe 40% AMI and below is really what we're looking at.
Senator Chang, you want to start off with that?
Yeah, this is a really tough issue, and I know it's been a priority for both chambers from years now, as long as I've been in the legislature. If I can zoom out and go back to our counterparts in Vienna, one of the most staggering facts that I learned there is that Vienna spends less on its rent subsidies than the state spends on Section 8. And Section 8, as we've already mentioned, is a federally funded program. And yet they have very little homelessness. And one of the reasons why they can spend less on rent subsidies and yet house more people is because in America, back to our friends, the Republicans, the late Republican President Ford, Section 8 pays market rents to private landlords. And in many cases, those rents are actually above the market because they will take into account Kaka'ako rent prices for, say, a nearby neighborhood with not as, luxurious housing. So Section 8 pays very high market rents to house a family. In Vienna, they can house their needy families, their Alice populations in government housing, in social housing, where the rent is much, much cheaper. And so that's how they're able to stretch their, rental subsidies, I think 3 to 1 compared to what we have in Hawaii. They're able to house 3 families for the cost of every one that we house here in Hawaii. And so if we create a large supply of government housing that is income blind, that is revenue neutral, I think that will enable us to make use of our rental subsidy programs for those who truly cannot afford housing much, much more efficiently. And, for us to house many more, Alice families in subsidized housing.
The only part I'd add to that, which was well said, was another thing that can help us say more efficiently using those resources towards those who need it most is we're kind of the first generation ever, again, who has made it in outlawed essentially multi-generational housing, right? So when people are trying to age in place or provide for other family members, it is almost impossible to do that in most of Hawaii, right? So part of the answer here is, again, making that process as easy as possible. If you can provide a unit for your family member who's in need or extremely low income or who's elderly, then you are freeing up actually, subsidized housing for those who just don't have access or don't have family or, have access to those kinds of needs.
All right, and we're going to our virtual questions now. I know you folks can't see it, but there are new virtual questions from new users that just came up. Somebody else asked, an anonymous attendee asked about Section 8. I'm responding to you individually, as Senator Chang had just addressed some of those some parts of that question just now. So Brian Lee asked, do you support legislation like California's SB 35 by right housing permit approvals if counties do not meet their regional housing needs assessments?
Yes.
Chair Chang.
Yeah, I certainly do. But we don't even have regional housing needs assessments, right? In Hawaii, we don't tell the counties how many units they need to build. And even if we did, the city and county of Honolulu provides annually a DPP report that says that there is no housing shortage because the population of Oahu is declining. So it's the most hilarious government report that I read every year. But the RHNA process, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment process in California, has existed for a very long time, I think since the 1960s or the 1980s. And that process has clearly not ended the housing shortage in California. It's if anything, it's made it worse. And so I know that the knee-jerk reaction here in Hawaii is always to look to, our friends in California. And I know that California has been really a font of housing innovation and housing legislation over the last 5 to 10 years because they have such a severe housing shortage, but they have not solved their housing shortage. They, And to the extent that rents have dropped in places like San Francisco, it's not because of any of the bills that have passed. It's because of, systemic problems like the rise of remote work and rising interest rates and so on. And so I always try to think of analogies to summarize these concepts. And I think, it's like, it would be like, looking to North Korea to research economic development legislation. California is the worst housing shortage in the United States. Why would we model our housing system on California's? I appreciate all that they're doing, but all the legislation that has passed, I think that there's a lot of, it will take time to create. And I was just at, the groundbreaking for the School Street redevelopment that HPHA is currently doing with High Ridge Costa. And that, that one building that a state developer is building will have 800 units in it, which is more, I think that's about the same number of units as the entire city and county of Honolulu ADU program since 2015 when it was introduced. So like if one government building can just like move the needle so much in comparison to, these other programs, I really think that the answer is, lies in the jurisdictions that have successfully solved housing shortages, like the Viennas, like the Singapores, like the Finlands.
Yeah, and just briefly, and this is why every time that Senator Chang and I have lunch, it ends up into a very spirited conversation. But the reason a lot of my legislation came from looking at California and Oregon and Washington and Montana, who have been at the forefront of pushing zoning reform. And I think the reason why we can look to a place like California is that they have had very heavily restricted suburban development patterns across the state for a long time. And in a lot of ways, they were, I wouldn't say first, they're probably second to experience the acute housing crisis that a lot of the country is feeling right now, right? Second, Hawaii, I think, was first, right? Our housing prices are high above everybody else, but they, in a lot of ways, other than Hawaii, were feeling it first, and they're forced to respond to it in a way that other states are just starting to catch up, right? So when you get Oregon and Washington and Montana, and some more than 50% of states last year had bills relating to zoning reform, right? They're all trying to grapple with how do we recognize the suburban experiment has not worked very well and reform our zoning codes at a state level. So I think California's been at the forefront. Are we going to copy everything? Certainly not, but I think we can take some lessons.
We have a question virtually from Trey Cordner for Senator Chang. Do you have a data on rent hikes after RURF funds expire? In some sense, I would expect the fair market value of efficiency units in a 60-year-old building is still affordable, relatively speaking, even if it is higher than what current tenants are used to paying.
Yeah, we just don't have that data. I think part of the reason why is because in practice, this doesn't happen all that often. Like I said, in practice, either the developer will themselves seek out additional state financing for renovations, or they will try to raise rents to market. The tenants will freak out, and then the state will be compelled to come back in and to buy the project again. So, example of that latter was the Front Street apartments in Lahaina, which came as it was, one of the major issues before the housing committee for, when I first came on, where the whatever restrictions on the units had expired. And because it was so well located right in the heart of Lahaina, the developer was in fact, raising the rents with these market units, and the tenants, after several years of organizing and advocacy and coming to the Capitol and so on, we're able to have the state step in and renegotiate a deal. Either way, the state taxpayers are on the hook.
All right, audience members in person, is there any new individuals that hasn't asked a question yet? We have a new question on virtual. This is another question for Senator Chang from Audrey McAvoy. What do you think about the proposal in the House to give counties the authority to phase out short-term rentals?
I'd be happy to answer that. I think, Chair Evslin, being a member of the House, might be a little bit better place to address it. But, as far as I'm aware, counties already have the authority to, forbid short-term rentals. I know that, my county, the city and county of Honolulu, it's very difficult to have a legal permitted short-term rental. In 2019, before the pandemic, the city and county cracked down further on enforcing its existing laws. And that, I think, caused an immediate drop on the rental sites like Airbnb and VRBO by, I think, 30 to 40%. So right away, overnight, there was a cliff where the inventory dropped. And then during the pandemic, obviously, demand for short-term rentals crashed even further. And today, we are still, I think, at least in my home county of Honolulu, short-term rental demand is still lower than it was pre 2019 enforcement crackdown. And yet we have not really seen, I mean, the market has softened, but I don't think anyone in Oahu has said the market is soft now because there are all these short-term vacation rentals re-entering the market. I think they're saying that, well, the high interest rates from Jerome Powell have really softened the market. So, maybe the other counties are different. Maybe they have a greater percentage of their housing stock in short-term use. But I would say that I'm totally in support of counties having the right to restrict short-term vacation rental use, but I wouldn't be as optimistic that would actually solve the problem.
So I can add to that. I agree totally with Senator Chang. It's not going to solve the problem. And in a lot of ways, like no individual policy here will solve it, right? It is, I think, still an all of the above approach. But the issue, at least that places like Kauai and Maui are facing, is again more vacation rentals every year than housing stock being built. So we're losing housing stock on those communities. And what the counties can do is they can restrict where vacation rentals can't be built or make up restrictions on how you can get this thing permitted. But the problem that they face is once somebody is using a home for a vacation rental use, the counties can't take that authority away from them at that point. And the counties have lost a number of lawsuits on this front, including city and county recently, I think, trying to change it 30-day duration to 90-day, lost on this front also. And so because state law is pretty clear on that front, so give the counties authority to phase out existing uses, I think is important, and probably important on the margins, right? The counties, I think, need to do more on the vacation rental front beyond just this in discouraging vacation rental uses. And I think the best tool they have to do so is through property taxes. As long as you're paying relatively low property taxes for a vacation rental, it's still going to make lots of financial sense to do it. We should discourage those through higher property taxes, which is solely, in county authority.
Thank you, Chair. Audience members, does anybody have a question that they haven't asked from somebody else? We have one more question from somebody new, and then we'll get back to you, okay? Angie Knight asks, her question for Section 8 is specific to project-based Section 8 usage for new affordable housing development, not the vouchers to be used more in the private market. Project-based makes new affordable units more affordable for the lower AMI levels, guarantees income for developers.
I think, sorry, the earlier question, I think that was possibly posted anonymously before. I think the question was in regards to how do we encourage more Section 8 uptick or use of Section 8 for public housing? Senator Chang, I'm going to put that one to you too.
Yeah, so project-based Section 8 is a relatively new federal program, and HPHA has been aggressively pursuing it. They have several of these in the works. I don't know what the limitations are. I don't know if every state gets a limit or a cap on the amount that they can do, but it is. I certainly think that that HPHA is moving full steam ahead on those projects.
Got it, Chair. Audience members, ma'am, I believe you had a question.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question is, how do we prevent the development of monster homing? And then also, how do we encourage the enforcement of federal laws related to housing? For example, I think it was all the way back in one of the Fords that when apartments were being built, I think it was in the 97, when apartments were being built, there was a requirement that there must be 10% of the housing set aside for low and medium housing. And that's never been enforced here in the state. And then how do we promote more rammed earth building structures? And maybe the idea of what the Japanese use is the capsule hotels. So rammed earth and capsule hotels might be some ways of resolving, but we do need to enforce the 10% allocation of all condominiums and apartments and all that kind of stuff, because haven't been enforced, and also prevent monster housing.
I can take part of this question. Rammed earth and capsule hotels, I'm not familiar with. Definitely, again, we'll do research and we can get back to you on that. Regarding monster homes, this has come up a number of times regarding my own proposal, which would allow 4 units by right? And there's a concern, particularly on Oahu, around the development of monster homes. And what my bill does, or would do if passed, is still gives the counties full authority to regulate what the house looks like, right? Which they have right now, but setback requirements, height requirements, floor area ratio. The counties have very, 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 very broad discretion in regulating form. So what this would say is essentially they've got to allow 4 uses within the house, but they can still say this house cannot be this giant, or modern apartment building in a single family area, right? It has to be done relatively in the character of this single family neighborhood. So you're freeing up the use within inside the house, which might mean you could have smaller units in that house. And I think
monster homes tend to be foreign owned.
Yeah. So all I'm saying is that the counties still have the authority to regulate the form of a house to discourage the development of monster houses. And I think what we're also seeing is that the reason we have, at least on Oahu, so many monster homes being built is that there is so much demand for housing because we are underproducing housing. And so in a lot of ways, there's this black market for housing, which monster homes are taking up, which people are incentivized to do possibly illegal things within that unit. And black markets exist when often government regulations are too strict in some way, right? It's in some way a market failure. And so how do we ensure that we are relieving the demand for monster homes is, I think, allow these uses more flexibly in broader neighborhoods while ensuring that the counties are regulating the form of development so that we're not building apartment complexes in single family neighborhoods. To the question of 10%. So all the counties do have some form of inclusionary housing requirements along those lines, right? If you're building a new development in every county, unless you're going through a 201H process.
It really isn't enforced here in Hawaii.
So yeah, I can get into some of the issues. So if you're building a development, between 10 and 30 or 40% even of the units in the new development will have to be affordable. The counties come up with that policy on their own. The issues why we often see new construction without it is either they got the entitlements for that development before the inclusionary policy went through, or they could have gone through a 201H process, or they could have gotten exemptions otherwise. And just to zoom out a little bit, is that those policies can have really detrimental effects in that, for example, Kauai, the island I'm most familiar with, had a 30% requirement. 30% of new homes for any development with 9 or more homes since 2008 had to be affordable. Since that policy passed in 2008, it was never triggered a single time. Because for a developer to actually build 9 homes, it means that they are building 30% of those homes and having to rent or sell them at below their cost. And it makes the price of the other 75% of the homes too high, essentially, for the market to bear.
And so that's why we should do rammed earth.
I
can see that.
So what Kauai's experience was essentially 0 market-based market rate homes built and 0 affordable homes built through this program. And we had a study that said it made the development of housing within our town cores literally infeasible. So the county ended up coming in and significantly altering that policy, that if you're maximizing your development, doesn't trigger the requirements. If you're doing a low density development out, then you're still going to have the requirement. Anyway, sorry, I went on too long there. Senator Chang, if you want to add to inclusionary housing
real quick, but real quick, we do have more questions that in the other individuals who haven't asked questions yet. So if we're able to get to that as soon as possible, because we only have 11 minutes left in the room.
Yeah.
Senator Chang.
I'll yield my time so we can get to more questions.
Okay, we have, thank you so much for your questions. We have one from Dean Yoshida for both Senator Chang and Representative Evslin. Given the funding sources for infrastructure are mainly at the county level for sewer, water, drainage, how would the legislature be able to coordinate the investment required to increase infrastructure capacity to increase the supply of housing at all price points?
Yeah, so I think that infrastructure, I think we can all agree that infrastructure is one of the biggest barriers to housing construction in all 4 counties of Hawaii in various ways. And so there are some existing tools, like HHFDC has the power to do, these infrastructure districts. They've just never used that power yet. That's why we're working on bills, as I've already mentioned in my presentation earlier, to tinker with that, to release some funding for that, to maybe potentially allow the rental housing revolving fund to be used for infrastructure, and to allow these other more innovative ways to finance infrastructure. So, I personally think that this is a solvable problem. Every time that somebody talks to me about how there isn't enough infrastructure along the rail line to sustain the thousands of units that you want to build, that I want to build, I'm always like, well, what? I mean, they'll always say something like, well, the city is not going to run the sewer there for another, 20 years. And my response is always, well, the state handled the infrastructure in Kaka'ako through HCDA. And yes, it took a long time, but, the reality is that thousands of units were in fact built in Kaka'ako. So it's not like it's impossible for the state to come in and either to directly pay for or through other means finance the infrastructure. I will say that, kind of the ultimate dream. So infrastructure is only a problem when you're building a small number of units. And the example that was, recently cited in a meeting that I was attending was when when the decision was made to develop the Eva Plain, the state did not pay for that infrastructure. The private developers in that region came together and took advantage of state financing vehicles that were not taxpayer dollars, but were state, facilities to finance the infrastructure that they then on which they then built the tens of thousands of units that now exist on the Eva Plain without a single taxpayer dime. So if the governor, if somebody designated that 20,000 units would go up at a given site, I don't think that, I think that the infrastructure would take care of itself. At that level of density, with that number of units, with that level of efficiency of scale, the developers that would come in and actually deliver those units would be able to deliver the infrastructure at a very low per unit cost. So, the problem is, how do we get the political will to designate that given parcel with 20,000 units instead of just a pilot project here or a pilot project there? And my hope is that once these pilot projects do get off the ground, that we will have the political will and momentum to do so.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that answer other than coming from the Kauai County Council. The Kauai County, and my guess is at least all the outer island counties are really facing an infrastructure crisis in that they are, say, road maintenance. Kauai County is $300 million backlog on road maintenance. Gas taxes aren't paying enough to maintain the roads, and property taxes aren't paying enough. So we're like literally going backwards every year until the county got authority to enact the excise tax surcharge. The same for water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure. And part of the root cause of the reason that the counties are essentially underwater and not able to fund even maintenance of their infrastructure is that we developed in a way post-World War II where we did have lots of sprawling subdivisions, right? And we continue to have very high development on agricultural land. And when we have scattered subdivisions, infrastructure is incredibly costly to those subdivisions. A city and county pays something like 50% less than us, than the county of Kauai, because their infrastructure is much more compact and much more efficient. And so part of the answer here is, again, how do we encourage our growth into the urban areas that have that infrastructure that were designed for that growth to occur, to make sure that we're using our infrastructure more efficiently. And then lastly, certainly dedicated financing tools, tax increment financing, which would require a constitutional amendment, which I believe there'll be a resolution to do so this year. And then again, increasing higher rates on the conveyance tax with dedicated source of funding for infrastructure. I think those are both necessary tools to move forward.
Audience members, is there any new questions from anybody? Anybody who's already come up have any questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Yeah, definitely. If we could limit our time to 1 minute per question, or just one question, because we only have 5 minutes in the room. Thank you.
One of the issues I see that circulates around housing is particularly Section 8 housing, is asking questions of the potential renter that has nothing to do with the actual securing the property. A friend of mine took out a lawsuit because they were injured at work. They wanted to move to another apartment, and the person's everything, the finance, everything was intact. And then the person who was the realtor said, well, what about this lawsuit you have against XYZ company, which had nothing to do with the rental of the property? How do we prevent those intrusive questions and irrelevant questions in the process of being denied Section 8 housing?
Senator Chang, you have an answer?
Yeah, I kind of want to maybe address this on a bit of a broader level. As I pointed out, Section 8 is a Republican program. It's a Ford program. And basically the deal was private landlords, the federal government is going to shower you with tons and tons of money, but you can't discriminate. And the private sector landlords were like, well, some of us are going to take the money, but a lot of us would rather discriminate than take the money. And the guaranteed checks from Uncle Sam rather than, the who knows if they're coming checks from individual tenants. And so I think that it's kind of a great example of how public-private partnerships don't really work. As you might know, over half of all people who receive a Section 8 voucher in Hawaii have to return it because they cannot find a landlord willing to rent to them. And so, we should just stop trying to commandeer the private sector. The government should just do it. The government does it, much more fairly. The government can, has its own problems, but it can police itself in a much more accountable and transparent way than, than thousands of individual, mom and pop landlords can be policed. And I really think that a lot of these problems stem from the government's abdication of its responsibility in the housing sphere over the last many decades.
Yeah, and some of that could be addressed through the Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws and landlord tenant code in Hawaii. And again, I can maybe talk to you afterwards and try and determine what is legal and what isn't legal for landlords to be asking. And if they're asking illegal questions, then there should be ramifications because of that. But I don't know enough off the top of my head to say what they can and cannot ask.
If you would like, you can talk to any of our staff and we'll be able to get you information, his email, our office number and whatnot. Thank you so much. I think that'll be our last question. We only have 2 minutes left. So mahalo to you guys for coming out, and Senator Chang and Rep. Evslin for the informational briefing. You guys have any closing remarks?
Yeah, again, just want to thank Senator Chang for setting this up. I am really excited for this legislative session. I think Senator Chang has been speaking eloquently about this for a decade here. I've looked up to him for a long time in the way that he's communicated the issues we face, and really one of the few people looking at really, really big, bold solutions. So I'm excited to dive in there and collaborate over this next session. And yeah, this crisis continues to get worse, and it's on our watch, and it's on us to figure out some solutions here. So thank you again, Senator Chang.
Thank you, Representative Evslin. It's been a pleasure working with you for the short time that we've sat across from each other. And I just want to say that I've been every time we talk, I'm just continually impressed by how willing you are to run into the fire, and to not dodge some of the tough battles, because you're not picking, the low-hanging fruit. What you're going for is really kind of at the heart of the question. And I think that that's something that I've learned from some of my colleagues over the years, that we may not prevail, we may not always get our way in year 1 or year 2 or even year 5, but over time, if we're persistent and if we work hard, I think we can move the needle. And I think that we see the ship of state turning on this issue. And I look forward to working with you to, continue that momentum, and to bring about a day in which all the people of Hawaii will have the ability to live here.
All right. Thank you, Senator Chang. Thank you, everybody,